The sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding into place is a noise you never truly get used to, no matter how many hundreds of times you hear it echoing down a concrete corridor. It is the sound of a door closing not just on a room, but on a life you thought you were entitled to live. My name is Julian, I'm 62 years old, and I am writing this from a cell in a Mexican state prison where the walls are painted appealing, institutional blue that seems to soak up the humidity and the regrets of everyone trapped inside them. I came to this country looking for a second act, a way to reinvent a man who felt like he was fading away in a quiet suburb in Connecticut. But I ended up finding a version of myself I never wanted to meet. I sit here now and realize that I wasn't brought down by a grand criminal conspiracy or a sudden stroke of bad luck. I was brought down by the terrifying, quiet vanity of an aging man who wanted to feel important one last time. Back home, I had spent 30 years in insurance, a life measured in premiums and risk assessments, where every decision was calculated to the fourth decimal point. When my marriage ended and the house felt too large for one person, the silence became a physical weight. I started looking south, captivated by the brochures of cobblestone streets and the promise of a place where my dollars would stretch further and my life might finally feel like an adventure, instead of a slow march toward a funeral. I settled in San Miguel de Allende, a place where the light hits the cathedrals in a way that makes you believe in miracles. For the first 6 months, I was the quintessential expat. I wore linen shirts, I learned enough Spanish to order my coffee and joke with the street vendors, and I felt the vitality I hadn't known since my 20s. It was in a small gallery off the main plaza that I met Elena. She was 28, with an energy that seemed to vibrate in the air around her, and when she looked at me, she didn't see a retired insurance adjuster with a slight limp and a thinning crown. She saw a man of means, a man of wisdom, a man who could help her change her world. The danger of being 60 and lonely is that you become an expert at lying to yourself. I saw the red flags early on, though I called them something else at the time. I called them cultural differences or the passion of youth. When Elena told me about her dream to open a boutique hotel in an old colonial ruins her family owned, my professional brain whispered that the numbers didn't add up. But my heart, or perhaps my ego, shouted louder. She made me feel like a protagonist again. She would sit across from me at dinner, leaning in close, telling me how the local banks wouldn't even look at a young woman without a powerful partner. I stepped into that role with a hunger that shames me now. I convinced myself I was being a mentor, a savior, a visionary. I ignored the fact that her uncle, the supposed owner of the land, never looked me in the eye. I ignored the way the legal documents were always rushed under my pen during long, wine-soaked lunches where the sun was too bright and the laughter was too easy. I signed papers I couldn't fully translate because I didn't want to admit to her that I was struggling with the language. I didn't want to break the spell of her admiration by asking for a dictionary. The hotel project became my entire world. I poured my savings into it, watching the stone walls rise and feeling a sense of legacy I'd never felt behind a desk in Connecticut. Elena was the one who handled the permits and the local labor, or so she told me. She brought me stacks of papers to sign, telling me they were for water rights, for electricity, for the municipal taxes that keep the wheels turning in a small town. I signed them all, fueled by the intoxicating feeling of being the man in charge. I didn't notice the shifts in her behavior until the walls were nearly finished. The late night phone call she took in the other room, the way she started talking about unexpected complications with the federal authorities, and the sudden, sharp coldness in her voice when I asked to see the accounting ledgers. One morning, I woke up in our rented villa to find the closets empty. Her scent was still in the air, but her passport, her jewelry, and every scrap of paper related to the hotel were gone. 2 hours later, the state police were at my door. They didn't ask questions. They showed me the documents I had signed. I hadn't been paying for permits. I had been signing off on a series of fraudulent environmental clearances and labor contracts for a company that was being used to wash money for people I never even met. Now the days here are long and marked by a heat that settles into your bones. In the beginning, I spent every waking hour in a state of frantic rage, writing letters to the embassy and demanding a lawyer who could explain that I was a victim, a fool, an innocent man. But as the months turned into a year, and the letters from my children grew shorter and less frequent, a strange and agonizing peace began to take hold. You learn a lot about yourself when you're stripped of your title, your bank account, and your dignity. I realized that Elena didn't steal my life. I handed it to her because I was too proud to grow old gracefully. I wanted to buy a few more years of feeling powerful. And I paid for it with the only thing I had left, my time. I look at the younger men in here, the ones who are truly dangerous, and I see a reflection of that same desperate need to be seen. I have learned to find a quiet kind of grace in the small things now. The way the shadows move across the cell floor, the taste of a fresh orange, the sound of the rain on the corrugated roof. My retirement isn't what I planned, but in this cage, I have finally stopped running from the man I actually am. I am Julian, I am 62, and I am finally painfully awake. The cell blocks here have a rhythm, a heavy mechanical heartbeat that dictates when you eat, when you wash, and when you are left alone with the ghosts of the decisions you made in the sunlight. In the first few months, I was convinced there had been a clerical error, some grand misunderstanding of the law that a single phone call to a high-priced attorney in Mexico City would rectify. I sat on my bunk with a legal pad, drafting timelines and highlighting the moments where Elena had misled me, as if building a case for my own heart would somehow convince the judge. I'd recount the specific Tuesday when she brought me the incorporation papers for the hotel's holding company. We were sitting in a shaded courtyard, the smell of jasmine heavy in the air, and she had laughed when I reached for my reading glasses. She told me I didn't need to worry about the fine print because her cousin, a supposed notary, had already vetted everything for our protection. I remember the feeling of the pen in my hand, a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen I'd bought myself to celebrate my retirement. I signed my name 16 times that afternoon. Each stroke of the pen was a nail I was unknowingly driving into the coffin of my own freedom. In this place, the concept of time becomes fluid and treacherous. When you are 62, a year isn't just 12 months, it is a measurable percentage of the life you have left, and watching those days slip away behind a reinforced door is a unique kind of torture. I spend a lot of time thinking about the small red flags I chose to interpret as charming quirks of doing business in a foreign land. There was the time the construction foreman asked for a cash payment in a parking lot, or the way Elena's uncle seemed to disappear whenever I asked to see the land registry. A man who spent 30 years assessing risk for a living should have seen the pattern, but I was intoxicated by the narrative I was writing for myself. I wanted to be the American who got it, the one who wasn't a rigid, suspicious tourist, but a man of the world who trusted his gut and his beautiful partner. I wasn't just investing in a hotel. I was investing in the lie that I was still the kind of man who could command a room and win the heart of a woman half my age. The silence from the outside world is perhaps the loudest thing in this prison. My son Liam hasn't written back in 4 months. The last email I received from him was a cold, clinical list of the items he had moved into a storage unit back in Connecticut after my bank accounts were frozen by the Mexican authorities. He didn't ask how I was sleeping, or if the guards were treated me fairly. He only asked how I could have been so incredibly reckless with the inheritance he thought was coming his way. That hurt more than the hard mattress or the meager rations. It forced me to realize that my second act in Mexico was built on the wreckage of the relationships I had neglected back home. I had traded the steady, boring love of my family for a temporary shot of adrenaline and a dream that turned out to be a hollow shell. Every night, when the lights go out and the shouting and the tear dies down to a low, rhythmic murmur, I have to face the fact that the man I thought I was, the wise, cautious, successful Julian, never really existed. He was just a costume I wore until the fabric finally tore. There is a particular kind of shame that comes with being an elderly man in a place designed for the young and the violent. I am the abuelo of the wing, a title given with a mixture of mocking pity and genuine confusion. The younger inmates don't understand how a man with my background, with my education and my resources, could end up sharing a toilet with them. They see my gray hair and my slumped shoulders, and they see a cautionary tale. Sometimes I see it too. I look in the small cracked mirror above the sink and I see a stranger who let his vanity drive him off a cliff. I traded my security for a feeling of relevance, and now I have all the relevance of a ghost. I spent my afternoons in the courtyard, watching the birds fly over the high walls, and I wonder if Elena ever thinks of me, or if I was just a line item in a ledger she's already closed. I suspect the latter. I was a tool, a signature, a source of capital that she liquidated with the same cold efficiency I used to apply to insurance claims. I've started to realize that the prison isn't just these 4 walls. It's the regret that follows you into every corner of your mind. I catch myself replaying that final lunch we had, searching for the moment the mask slit, the split second where her eyes might have shown a flicker of remorse. But there was nothing. She played her part perfectly until the very end because she knew exactly what I was hungry for. She didn't have to be a master criminal. She just had to be a mirror. She reflected back the man I wanted to be, and I was so grateful for the view that I never bothered to look at what was happening behind the glass. Now, the only thing I have left is the truth, and it is a heavy, jagged thing to carry. I am learning to live with it, though. I am learning that peace doesn't come from being right or being successful. It comes from finally stopping the lie. I am a prisoner, yes, but for the first time in my life, I am not a fraud. The legal system in this country is a labyrinth of paperwork and unspoken expectations that I was completely unprepared to navigate. When the investigators first sat me down in that small, windowless room, they didn't see an elderly man who had been swindled. They saw a signature on a series of environmental waivers that allowed a construction firm to dump toxic runoff into a protected watershed. To them, I was the prestigious, the front man. They laid out the documents I'd signed during those long, sun-drenched lunches with Elena, pointing to the clauses that designated me as the sole administrator with full legal liability. I tried to explain that I didn't speak the language well enough to understand the nuances of the cláusula de responsabilidad, but the lead investigator just looked at me with a weary, cynical kind of pity. He asked me why a man with a career in risk management would sign away his life for a hotel project he didn't even own. I didn't have an answer that didn't make me sound like a pathetic old man chasing a ghost, so I stayed silent. The first 90 days in the state prison were a blur of sensory overload and cold, visceral terror. I was processed into a world where my American passport meant nothing, and my age was my only shield. I remember the first night, lying on a thin mat on a concrete slab, listening to the cacophony of 100 men breathing, snoring, and whispering in a language that suddenly felt like a weapon. Every time the heavy steel gate at the end of the tier slammed shut, I felt a physical jolt in my chest, a reminder that the world I knew, the world of thermostats, soft pillows, and quiet mornings, was gone. I had to learn the unwritten rules of survival. Never look a man in the eye for too long, never complain about the food, and always keep your back to a wall. I became a ghost in my own life, moving through the yard with a bowed head, trying to shrink into the shadows so the younger, more predatory inmates wouldn't see me as a target. The trap Elena set wasn't just financial, it was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. I found out through a court-appointed translator that the uncle who supposedly owned the land was actually a local fixer, with a long history of land grab schemes. The boutique hotel was never intended to be finished. It was a sinkhole project designed to attract foreign capital that could then be diverted through various subcontractors, all of whom were shell companies owned by the same group of people. I was the useful idiot, the person whose name was on the permits, so that when the federal audit inevitably happened, there would be a clear foreign trail leading straight to my door. Elena had played the role of the devoted partner while systematically stripping me of every legal defense I had. She knew that I was too proud to ask for a second opinion and too enamored with her to suspect that every "I love you" was a calculated move in a game I didn't even know I was playing. I spent my first few months waiting for a savior who never came. I thought the American consulate would ride in with a team of lawyers to demand my release, or that my insurance colleagues back home would pool their resources to help one of their own. But the reality of international law is a cold, indifferent machine. Because I had signed the documents voluntarily, and because the crimes involved environmental and financial fraud against the Mexican state, there was no magic wand to wave. I was just another foreigner who had overstepped his bounds and gotten caught in the gears. I remember sitting in the visiting area, looking through the scratched plexiglass at a lawyer I could barely afford, and realizing that my life was now measured in ampros and centitias. The sophisticated Julian who once managed multi-million-dollar claims was gone, replaced by a man who was grateful when he managed to trade a pack of cigarettes for an extra blanket. There is a specific kind of atmospheric pressure in a Mexican prison, a mix of humidity, the smell of burnt corn, and a pervasive sense of waiting. You wait for the roll call. You wait for the water to be turned on. You wait for a letter that usually doesn't arrive. I started to notice that the men who survived best here weren't the strongest or the loudest, but the ones who could accept their reality without letting it break their spirit. I began to watch the older Mexican inmates, the ones who sat in the shade of the courtyard every afternoon, playing dominoes with a quiet, dignified intensity. They didn't talk about the past or the injustice of their sentences. They focused on the game and the small, immediate comforts of the present. It was from them that I began to learn the first lessons of my new life. I realized that my rage and my self-pity were just more forms of vanity, another way of saying that I was too good to be here. Once I let go of that, the bars didn't seem quite as close together. By the second year, the sharp, jagged edges of my anger had begun to wear down into a dull, heavy ache. The new car smell of my retirement, the one that smelled like sea salt, expensive tequila, and the perfume Elena wore, had been replaced by the permanent scent of bleach and scorched beans. It's funny how the mind adapts to a cage. I found myself looking forward to the most mundane markers of time, the way the light would hit a specific crack in the courtyard wall at 3 o'clock, or the Tuesday deliveries when the sound of the truck meant the world outside still existed. I stopped checking my watch because time in here doesn't move forward. It just circles around you. I started to see my life in Connecticut not as a lost paradise, but as a series of missed opportunities for genuine connection. I realized that for decades I had been providing for my family as a way to avoid actually knowing them. I bought my wife a new kitchen so I wouldn't have to talk about why we stopped sleeping in the same bed. I paid for my son's private college so I wouldn't have to admit I didn't know what he was passionate about. That realization was a different kind of sentence. It's one thing to be locked away for a crime you were too proud to see coming. It's another to realize you've been a prisoner of your own making for 30 years. I sat through the long, humid afternoons thinking about the letters I should have written 10 years ago, long before I ever stepped foot in Mexico. I thought about the red flags in my own character, the way I always needed to be the smartest person in the room, the way I used my bank account as a shield against vulnerability. Elena didn't create those flaws, she just used them as a roadmap to my destruction. She saw a man who was so terrified of being ordinary that he would jump at the chance to be a king, even if the crown was made of glass. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would have been more or less lonely if I had just stayed in that big, quiet house in Connecticut and learned how to be a grandfather instead of trying to be a legend. The health issues started around month 18, a nagging pain in my lower back that radiated down my leg, the kind of thing I would have seen a specialist for back home with one phone call. Here, it meant a 3-week wait to see a harried infirmary doctor who gave me a look of profound exhaustion and a packet of ibuprofen. It was a stark reminder that my body was aging, regardless of the vitality I thought I had bought for myself. I realized that I was losing the one thing I had tried so hard to protect, my independence. In the insurance world, we talked about long-term care and quality of life as abstract concepts on a spreadsheet. In this cell, they are the difference between a day you can bear and a day that breaks you. I had to learn to ask for help from the younger inmates, to trade my meager commissary snacks for someone to help me carry a heavy water bucket. The pride that had been my armor for 60 years was being stripped away, layer by painful layer. One afternoon, a priest who visits the prison once a month sat with me in the yard. He didn't offer me platitudes or tell me that God had a plan for my suffering. He just asked me if I had forgiven the man I was when I arrived in San Miguel. I told him I hated that man, that I wanted to reach back through time and shake him until his teeth rattled for being so incredibly stupid. The priest just nodded and told me that hate is just another way of staying connected to a ghost. He said that until I could look at my own vanity with compassion instead of contempt, I would always be Elena's prisoner, no matter when they finally opened the gates. That night, for the first time since my arrest, I didn't dream about the hotel or the courtroom. I dreamed about my son, Liam, when he was 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders at a park. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had truly laughed with him without thinking about what it was costing me in time or money. There is a profound, agonizing peace that comes when you finally stop fighting your reality. I stopped looking at the gate every time it opened. I stopped checking the mail with a racing heart. I began to teach English to some of the younger guards and a few of the inmates who wanted a better life when they got out. It wasn't because I wanted to be a hero anymore. It was because it was the only thing I had to give that couldn't be stolen, taxed, or used against me. I found that when I stopped trying to be Julian, the success story, people actually started to like me. They liked the man who knew how to listen, the man who didn't have all the answers but was willing to sit in the dirt and figure it out with them. My world had shrunk to the size of a postage stamp. But for the first time, the people in it were real, and so was I. I don't know when I'm getting out. In this system, dates are more like suggestions than promises, and my lawyer's visits have become less about freedom and more about the logistics of staying alive. My 401k has been drained by legal fees and administrative costs that I stopped questioning a year ago. If I ever walk out of these gates, I won't be returning to a colonial villa or a house in Connecticut. I will be a 60-something man with a criminal record and a cardboard box, starting over in a world that has largely moved on without him. But the strange thing, the thing that keeps me awake at night not with terror, but with a quiet, steady wonder, is that I am no longer afraid of that emptiness. I spent my whole life building walls of money and status to keep the world from seeing that I was just a man. And now that the walls have been torn down, I find the air is finally breathable. I am broke, I am aging, and I am a convict, but I am also, for the first time in 62 years, entirely honest. I think about the people watching this, perhaps sitting in their own quiet houses, feeling that same itch of invisibility that drove me south. You might be looking at real estate in a foreign land, or imagining a life where you are finally the hero of your own story. There is nothing wrong with a fresh start, but I'm here to tell you that the geography doesn't matter if you are bringing the same hollow heart with you. If you were running toward a dream because you were too afraid to face the reality of your own reflection, the world will eventually find a way to show you what you're hiding from. Elena didn't find me because I was a good investor. She found me because I was a man who needed to be lied to. I was a willing participant in my own deception, and that is a debt that no amount of money can ever truly pay off. Sometimes, at night, I can hear the distant sound of music from the town a wedding or a festival happening just beyond the ridge. It used to make me weep with bitterness, thinking of the wine I should be drinking and the life I should be leading. Now I just listen to the rhythm and realize that life is continuing exactly as it should. The world doesn't owe me a happy ending just because I worked hard and played by the rules for most of my life. The only thing we are ever truly owed is the present moment. And even in a cell, that moment can be enough if you stop trying to trade it for something shinier. I've started writing letters to Liam again, not to ask for money or to complain about the heat, but to tell him about the birds I see in the courtyard and to ask him what his favorite memory of us is. He hasn't answered yet, but that's okay. I'm not writing to get a response anymore. I'm writing to finally be a father who listens. I have found a profound, agonizing peace in the realization that my life is not a tragedy. A tragedy is a man who dies never knowing why he was lonely. I know exactly why I'm here. I'm here because I valued the shadow of a woman's admiration more than the substance of my own integrity. I'm here because I thought I could skip the hard work of growing old by buying a younger version of myself. There is a price for that kind of vanity, and I'm paying it every single day. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the prison is as still as a tomb, I feel a sense of clarity that I wouldn't trade for all the villas in San Miguel. I am Julian. I am 62 years old, and I am finally learning that the only freedom that matters is the one you find when you have nothing left to lose. If you are standing at a crossroads, looking at a path that seems too good to be true, please look closer. Don't look at the person offering you the dream. Look at the part of yourself that is so desperate to believe them. The red flags aren't just warnings about other people. They are mirrors reflecting our own deepest needs. Don't wait until you're behind bars, whether they're made of iron or just the expectations of a life you hate to admit who you really are. It is a long, hard road to get back to the truth, and it will cost you everything you think you own. But take it from a man who lost it all. The truth is the only thing that will ever actually make you feel at home.